You drink it every morning without thinking twice. A warm cup of coffee. Maybe black, maybe with cream, maybe with enough sugar to make a dentist cry. But there was a time in human history when holding a cup of coffee could get you arrested, beaten, or even killed. Not in one country, not in one empire. Across 3 separate continents, world leaders, religious authorities, and paranoid kings looked at this simple brown drink and declared war on it. And the reasons they gave will tell you something about power, fear, and control that still applies to the world you live in right now. To understand why coffee terrified the powerful, you have to go back to where it started. The story begins in the highlands of Ethiopia, somewhere around the 9th century. The legend you have probably heard is that a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats dancing wildly after eating red berries from a certain bush. He tried them himself. He felt wide awake, alert, buzzing with energy. He brought the berries to a local monastery, and a monk tossed them into the fire because he thought they were the devil's work. The roasted beans smelled incredible. They ground them up, added hot water, and the first cup of coffee was born. That is the legend. The real history is murkier, but the facts are even more interesting. The Ethiopian scholar and monk Sheikh Jamal al-Din al-Dabhani is credited with helping popularize coffee drinking in the port city of Aden in Yemen during the 15th century. He saw how Sufi monks used it to stay awake during long nighttime prayers. Coffee was not a casual beverage. It was a spiritual tool, a fuel for devotion. And from Aden it spread like wildfire through the Islamic world. By the late 1400s, coffee houses were appearing in Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. And that is when things got interesting, because coffee houses did something that no ruler wanted. They brought ordinary people together in one place, wide awake, fully alert, and talking to each other. Think about that for a moment. Before coffee, what did people drink? Alcohol, beer, wine, spirits, and what does alcohol do? It makes you drowsy, compliant, slow. You drink enough ale and you go home and sleep. You are not plotting revolutions. You are not debating politics. You are not writing poetry that criticizes the sultan. But coffee sharpened the mind, it loosened the tongue, and it turned every coffee house into a potential center of dissent. The first major crackdown came in 1511 in Mecca. Kar Beg, the governor of Mecca, called an emergency meeting of jurists and physicians. He argued that coffee was an intoxicant, and intoxicants were forbidden under Islamic law. A poet named Al-Mukafa had reportedly used coffee houses to mock the governor openly. The jurists agreed. Coffee was banned. Coffee houses were shut down. Anyone caught selling or drinking coffee faced punishment. But here is the thing that tells you how much people loved this drink. The ban did not last. The Sultan in Cairo overturned it within months. People simply refused to stop. The Ottoman historian Pesevi Ibrahim Effendi documented the explosion of coffee houses in Istanbul by the early 1500s, describing them as places where men gathered to play chess, read books, listen to music, and discuss the news of the day. He wrote that there were over 600 coffee houses in Istanbul alone. 600, in a city where the authorities kept trying to shut them down. So the Sultan tried again. In 1633, Murad IV, one of the most feared Ottoman emperors in history, issued a decree making the consumption of coffee punishable by death. Yes, death. He had spies patrol the streets. If they caught someone carrying coffee or visiting a coffee house, they could be beaten on the spot. Repeat offenders were sewn into leather bags and thrown into the Bosphorus. Murad IV reportedly disguised himself and walked the streets at night, personally looking for coffee drinkers. He once strangled a man with his own hands for violating the ban. Why was a powerful emperor so terrified of a drink? Because coffee houses had become political spaces. Men gathered there to criticize the government, organize protests, and spread ideas that challenged royal authority. The coffee house was the internet of the 1600s, and every authoritarian ruler understood that if you control where people gather and talk, you control what they think. Now let us cross the ocean to Europe, where coffee arrived in the early 1600s and immediately caused a new kind of panic. When coffee first reached Venice in 1615, local clergy condemned it as the bitter invention of Satan. It came from the Muslim world. It was dark. It was mysterious. Priests called it a tool of the devil and demanded that Pope Clement VI ban it outright. But the Pope, according to accounts compiled by the historian Mark Pendergrast in his book Uncommon Grounds, decided to taste it first. He took a sip. He paused, and then he reportedly said that this drink should be baptized and declared a Christian beverage. Coffee survived the Vatican by the narrowest of margins. One taste. That is all that stood between coffee and extinction in Europe. But London was a different story entirely. In England, coffee houses became so influential that they earned a specific nickname. They were called penny universities. For the price of 1 penny, you could buy a cup of coffee and sit for hours listening to the brightest minds in the city debate philosophy, science, politics, and commerce. Lloyd's of London, the world's most famous insurance market, started as a coffee house run by Edward Lloyd in the 1680s. The London Stock Exchange began as a group of men meeting in a coffee house called Jonathan's Coffee House. The French Enlightenment was fueled in part by Parisian café culture. The American Revolution was plotted in coffee houses in Boston and Philadelphia. And that is exactly why King Charles II of England tried to ban them all. In December 1675, he issued a proclamation declaring that coffee houses were places where false, malicious, and scandalous reports were spread against the government. He demanded that every coffee house in England be shut down within 2 weeks. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Merchants, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens pushed back so hard that Charles was forced to reverse the ban in just 11 days. 11 days. He lasted less than 2 weeks against the will of people who refused to give up their coffee. Across the continent in Prussia, Frederick the Great took his own crack at coffee control in the 1770s. He was not worried about politics. He was worried about money. Prussia was spending a fortune importing coffee beans, and Frederick wanted that money spent on domestic beer and grain instead. So he banned private coffee roasting. He created an official state monopoly on coffee and hired over 100 special agents to patrol neighborhoods, sniffing the air for the illegal aroma of roasting coffee. People caught roasting without a license were fined. Some were imprisoned. The historian Brian Cowan, in his work on British and European coffee culture, documented how these attempts to suppress coffee always generated the same result. The more you tried to ban it, the more people wanted it. So here is the pattern that 3 continents, 6 centuries, and dozens of failed bans all reveal. Coffee was never just a drink. It was a technology of awareness. It made people sharper, more connected, more social, and harder to control. Every authoritarian who banned it said the same thing. It causes unrest. It breeds rebellion. It makes people ask dangerous questions, and they were not wrong. Coffee houses genuinely were places where revolutions were born, where financial empires were founded, where scientific ideas were exchanged, and where ordinary people learned that their voices mattered. The historian Ralph Hattocks, in his landmark study, Coffee and Coffee Houses, argued that the repeated attempts to ban coffee across the Islamic world and Europe were never really about the substance itself. They were about the social spaces it created. A coffee house is a democratic room. Anyone can walk in. Anyone can speak. And when you combine that openness with a chemical that makes you sharp and alert, you get something that every power structure in history has found genuinely threatening. And that brings you back to your morning cup. You pour it without fear. You sip it at your desk, in your car, on your couch. No emperor will drown you for it. No pope will call it Satan's drink. No king will shut down your cafe, but the reason you drink it is exactly the same reason they feared it. You need to wake up. You need to think clearly. You need to be sharp enough to face whatever the day throws at you. Every cup of coffee you drink is an act of defiance that a handful of kings, sultans, and governors once tried to outlaw and failed. The drink won, every single time. Across 3 continents, across 600 years, against the most powerful people alive. Your morning coffee is not a habit. It is a tradition of resistance that you inherited from monks, rebels, poets, merchants, and revolutionaries who all refused to stop drinking it no matter who told them to. So tomorrow, when you pour that cup, remember, you are not just waking up. You are continuing the longest, most caffeinated rebellion in human history. And you are doing it in pajamas.